I never imagined I'd watch my childhood home, a century-old Victorian masterpiece passed down through 3 generations, burned to ashes while my neighbor Karen stood across the street sipping her morning latte like it was just another Wednesday. The flames danced in her sunglasses as she chatted with her fellow HOA board members, her smirk cutting deeper than the smoke that stung my eyes. But what she didn't know, and what made this entire moment strangely empowering, is that I'm not just the quiet, reclusive neighbor she thought she could bully into compliance. I'm a federal judge, and her smug little kingdom, it was about to crumble. Just hours earlier, I'd been presiding over a high-profile case involving corporate fraud. My courtroom was silent as the verdict rang out, gavel firm in my hand. Minutes later, everything changed with a single text from my clerk. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire." That was the moment my two worlds collided, the law I uphold and the home I'd spent my life protecting. Karen always saw my house as an eyesore, the last holdout on a street she had slowly transformed with her HOA army of beige conformity. She'd tried everything: fake invitations to join her newly formed HOA, citations for non-regulation roses, threats disguised as concerned neighborhood safety notices. I declined them all, politely but firmly. She mistook my restraint for weakness. That was her first mistake. I stayed quiet, watched, documented. I let her think she was winning. Because people like Karen? They only understand power when it knocks on their door wearing a badge and carrying a warrant. She didn't know who I was, not really. She didn't know about the cameras I'd hidden, the documents I'd saved, the allies I'd quietly gathered, and she definitely didn't know that the person she'd just pushed too far was the very one with the authority to hold her accountable on a federal level. So yes, my home was in ruins, but my resolve, stronger than ever. And what Karen didn't realize was that she hadn't just ignited a fire on my porch, she'd lit the fuse to her own downfall. And oh, how satisfying it was going to be to watch her empire fall. It started with a glossy envelope slipped into my mailbox, crisp, gold-trimmed, and reeking of false hospitality. Inside was an invitation to join the newly formed HOA, complete with a sleek brochure of beige homes, manicured lawns, and rows of identical mailboxes. It would have been laughable if it weren't so ominous. Alongside the smiling photos was a mandatory list of property modifications. Remove my home's historic purple trim, demolish my grandmother's heritage rose garden, and replace the century-old wind chimes with approved decorative fixtures. Oh, and a $5,000 initiation fee, followed by $350 monthly dues. The tone was friendly, the message clear: conform or be punished. Karen Thompson, self-appointed HOA president and full-time dictator in yoga pants, stood across the street that afternoon, watching my reaction like a hawk. When I didn't rush over with a pen and checkbook, she approached my porch with that faux sweet smile I'd come to recognize as a mask for malice. "You're the last house on the block, you know," she chirped, her eyes scanning the peeling paint she loathed so much. "We really need you on board to unify the neighborhood's aesthetic." "I appreciate the offer," I said evenly, standing tall on the porch my grandfather built with his own hands, "but my home is a registered historic property. I won't be joining." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before she leaned in slightly, her tone dropping just enough to send a chill down my spine. "You might want to reconsider. Old homes like this? They're tricky. A little wiring issue here, a loose beam there. Sometimes accidents just happen." I narrowed my eyes, every legal instinct in me ignited. "Is that a threat?" "Oh no," she purred, straightening up. "Just neighborly concern." That night, I barely slept. My grandmother's wind chimes rang softly outside, a lullaby that usually brought peace but now felt like a warning. I installed security cameras around the property and pulled every zoning law, property map, and building permit tied to my land. She wanted a fight. I was ready to take it to court. The next morning, I caught Karen pacing with 2 other board members in front of my gate, whispering and pointing at different parts of my home like it was a condemned building. One of them carried a clipboard, the other, a camera. My blood boiled as I watched them take photos of my garden, my windows, even my chimney. I opened the front door and called out calmly, "You're trespassing. I suggest you leave." Karen didn't even flinch. She turned slowly and smiled. "We're simply preparing for the board's compliance review. You'll be hearing from us soon." Her message was clear. I could join their little club or become their next target. What she didn't know was that I had faced bigger threats in the courtroom, and I had no intention of letting some suburban tyrant rewrite the legacy of my home. This was more than a battle over paint colors. This was war. The harassment began like a slow leak, subtle, deniable, just enough to make you question your own nerves. At first, it was the anonymous complaints. Every few days, a neon orange violation notice appeared on my front door. My grass was 0.4 inches too tall, my trash bin was visible for an extra hour on collection day, my roses, my grandmother's treasured roses, were deemed a potential hazard for attracting bees. I knew exactly where it was coming from. Karen and her HOA cronies weren't even trying to be discreet anymore. Then came the noise. Every Saturday at 7 a.m. sharp, a landscaping crew would fire up their mowers and trimmers directly outside my bedroom window. Always the same crew, always on my side of the street. And curiously, never requested by me. When I confronted them, they just shrugged. "We're contracted by the HOA," one of them mumbled before firing up the leaf blower again. The sound was deafening. That morning, as I sat at my kitchen table with a headache pulsing behind my eyes, I realized what they were doing. Death by 1,000 decibels. The meetings followed. Karen, ever the theatrical ringmaster, began hosting HOA gatherings in her driveway, strategically positioned just outside my home office window. Her voice, smug and amplified, echoed through my walls as she rallied her allies with speeches about community standards and problematic properties. She never said my name, but every sideways glance toward my house, every chuckle at a pointed joke made it clear who the target was. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was psychological warfare. My mail began to disappear. My recycling bin went missing. Once, I found it tossed 3 blocks down the road, empty and dented. My outdoor security lights were mysteriously unscrewed one night. When I reviewed the footage, the camera had cut out at precisely 2:13 a.m. Too clean to be coincidence. The footage returned at 2:34, revealing nothing but a gently swinging gate. They were testing my patience, my limits, my ability to fight back. Every day, Karen strutted by with her golden retriever in tow, offering a plastic smile and an offhand comment. "Still haven't fixed that trim?" she'd ask, eyes sparkling with condescension. "Such a shame. You used to have the prettiest house on the block." But I wasn't breaking. Not yet. I began documenting everything. The notices, the disruptions, the comments. I created a folder labeled Evidence HOA Harassment, and each entry added fuel to the fire burning inside me. I wasn't just protecting my home anymore. I was preparing for a battle. What Karen didn't realize was that she wasn't just poking a neighbor. She was poking a federal judge. And while she waged her petty war with garden ordinances and gossip, I was building a case, one that would turn her little kingdom upside down. She thought she was winning. She had no idea what was coming. The line between harassment and outright danger was crossed the night I caught them skulking around my property like common criminals. It was just past midnight, and I had gotten up for a glass of water when the motion sensor light flicked on. There, in the hazy glow of the porch light, stood Karen and 2 other HOA board members, Barbara and her bulldog-faced husband, Craig, armed with spray canisters and measuring tape, whispering like children up to no good. But these weren't mischievous teens. These were grown adults, trespassing, tampering, and targeting. They were spraying my grandmother's rose bushes. My heart dropped, and the rage surged instantly. Those bushes had been there for over 60 years, a living monument to a woman who survived the Depression, raised 3 kids, and taught me the value of standing tall in the face of bullies. Now, they were wilting under a chemical attack led by a woman whose greatest life achievement was a HOA title pinned to her fake pearl cardigan. I stormed out onto the porch, phone recording, fury in my voice. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen, cool as ever, turned with that trademark condescending smile. "Eliminating invasive species," she said like she was quoting a gardening guide, not destroying someone's history. "This isn't personal, Judge. Just enforcing HOA standards." Her smugness made my blood boil. "On private property? Without permission? Are you completely out of your mind?" Barbara avoided eye contact. Craig muttered something about safety regulations. Karen just stood there, chin high, daring me to lose control. The next morning, the roses were dead. Blackened leaves, brittle stems, the sweet scent of their blossoms replaced by the sickening stench of whatever poison they'd used. That wasn't enforcement. That was vengeance. And it only got worse. The following week, a mysterious code enforcement officer showed up claiming complaints had been filed about electrical hazards. Funny, considering I'd passed my annual inspection just days earlier. Then came a noise complaint for a piano recital I hadn't even hosted. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Every day, it felt like a new ambush. Lights installed to blast through my bedroom windows. Flyers pasted on my fence labeling my home a community nuisance. One morning, I found a dead squirrel shoved in my mailbox, a sick little calling card from someone who clearly thought this was a game. Karen was testing me, seeing how far she could go. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that I'd been through worse. I'd sat on benches delivering justice to hardened criminals, to corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. Karen Thompson, with her real estate flyers and intimidation tactics, was nothing compared to the people I'd faced in court. But she had just made this personal. She hadn't just vandalized property. She'd desecrated memories. She'd stepped onto sacred ground. And for that, I was done playing nice. The morning my house burned down is etched into my memory like a scar. Deep, raw, and permanent. It started like any other. I was standing in my chambers, halfway through sentencing a petty fraud case, when my courtroom clerk burst through the doors, her face pale, voice shaking. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire!" Everything froze. The gavel dropped from my hand, clattering onto the bench. For a moment, all I could hear was a rushing in my ears, my heartbeat drowning out everything else. I didn't even wait to adjourn. I just ran. 15 minutes later, I was standing on the curb, watching my life collapse in flames. My beautiful, century-old Victorian home, the same one my grandmother had passed down, where I learned to ride a bike, where I studied for the bar exam, where my parents' wedding photo still hung above the fireplace, was being devoured by fire. Thick, black smoke twisted into the sky, wooden beams cracked like gunfire. The purple trim, so lovingly preserved over the decades, curled and blackened under the heat. But what made my blood truly run cold wasn't the destruction. It was the sight of Karen Thompson standing across the street, coffee mug in hand, watching like it was just another neighborhood show. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shocked. She was smiling. I tried to move, to scream, but my legs wouldn't work. And then I saw them. 2 of her HOA board members, Bob and Craig, lingering near her driveway. Craig's boots were dusted with ash. Bob's sleeves were smudged with something dark. And something inside me snapped. The fire chief approached, grim-faced, blaming old wiring. But I knew better. I'd had an inspection just last week. My security cameras were state-of-the-art, until I checked the footage and found a blank gap from 3 o'clock to 4 a.m., precisely when the fire started. This wasn't faulty wiring. This was war. Karen walked over, feigning concern. "Such a shame," she purred, swirling her coffee. "If only you joined the HOA. We have strict safety standards, you know. Fires like this don't happen under our watch." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because if I did, I would have screamed, cried, hit something. Instead, I watched the fire crews drown the embers of everything I'd loved, everything that was home, and I remembered every threat she'd made, the warnings, the code violations, the harassment, the roses, the trespassing, the dead squirrel, the late-night whispers about progress and modernization. She'd hinted, She'd pushed, and now she'd acted. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they'd set fire to the wrong house. This wasn't just any home. It was my home. And I wasn't just any neighbor. I was Judge Sarah Martinez, a federal judge, a woman with friends in the FBI, the Attorney General's office, and more legal power than Karen could ever hope to understand. I turned, walked calmly to my car, and drove away, straight to my office, where I began collecting every piece of evidence I'd documented over the last 6 months. The photos, the letters, the audio files, the HOA records I'd quietly subpoenaed after the first threats. I called in favors, I opened investigations, and I promised myself one thing. Karen Thompson would never touch another home again. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't mourn. I planned. Because when Karen struck that match, she didn't just ignite my house. She lit a fuse that was going to blow her entire empire to ashes. The ashes of my home had barely cooled before the investigation began. Not a police inquiry, not yet, but my own. This wasn't just personal retribution. It was the pursuit of justice, something I had sworn to uphold in courtrooms across the country. But this time, I wasn't presiding behind the bench. I was standing in the rubble, armed not with a gavel, but with every ounce of determination a judge could muster when the law had failed her. It started with the land. Late that night, I pored over zoning maps, tax records, and historical property deeds. That's when I found it. The blueprint for a city-backed highway expansion buried in an old transportation proposal. My property sat at the very center of it. Without it, the development couldn't proceed. Karen and her cronies hadn't just targeted me because of purple trim and heritage roses. My home had been the final piece in a lucrative land acquisition puzzle, and I was the one person who refused to fold. Fueled by rage and clarity, I hired a private investigator, someone I trusted from my days on the bench, discreet and relentless. Within days, he uncovered a paper trail leading to shell companies, all tracing back to Karen's sister-in-law. The same shell company had quietly bought out 3 other houses on our block after mysterious incidents forced the owners to sell below market value. Fires, code violations, break-ins, each one suspicious, each one conveniently followed by a sale. But the real break came when Karen's former assistant treasurer, a quiet, soft-spoken woman named Maria, reached out to my attorney in confidence. Over tea in a nondescript cafe 2 towns over, Maria handed over a flash drive. Her hands shook as she explained how Karen had been forcing her to cook the HOA books for years. Threats, manipulation, even bribes disguised as emergency landscaping funds. The drive contained 5 years of HOA financials, emails, and payment records, including sudden cash deposits after every accidental house loss in the area. Each page I read felt like peeling back another layer of rot. HOA funds had been misused to cover cleanup costs, payments to Thompson Landscaping, owned by Karen's brother, fake fire safety consultations billed by her cousin's shell firm, and most damning of all, a $75,000 deposit into Karen's personal bank account just 3 days after my home burned. I forwarded everything to the FBI. The fraud, the financial abuse, the coercion, they didn't hesitate. The deeper I dug, the more sinister it became. Karen's husband, retired Police Sergeant Bob Thompson, had been the fire inspector on several of the accidents, rubber stamping reports to keep investigators from asking too many questions. His reports all read the same. Electrical fault. Case closed. But the case wasn't closed, and I was far from done. Security footage from other neighbors, photos of inspections happening at midnight, recordings of Karen at HOA meetings casually discussing getting rid of problems. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the avalanche I was building. And Karen, arrogant in her control, never saw it coming. It wasn't just a matter of rebuilding my home anymore. It was about stopping a dangerous network of corruption that had terrorized families, driven out longtime residents, and profited from fear. Karen had underestimated me. She thought I was just another stubborn neighbor clinging to the past. She didn't realize she'd gone to war with a federal judge trained to dissect lies, expose abuse, and hold the powerful accountable. Now, the judge wasn't in chambers. She was in the neighborhood, and she was about to deliver a verdict no one would forget. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like a storm on the horizon. Quiet at first, but humming with the promise of chaos. As I approached the community center, the very place Karen had once turned into her throne room, I felt the eyes of every neighbor turn toward me, some with pity, some with curiosity, and others with something I hadn't seen in months: hope. I clutched my leather briefcase a little tighter, every step echoing with the weight of what I was about to do. Karen stood at the front of the room in her usual smug posture, sipping coffee from her oversized mug as if she hadn't just orchestrated the destruction of my home. But tonight, she wasn't the one holding the gavel. "Before we begin," Karen called out sweetly, "I'd like to introduce the emergency redevelopment proposal for 247 Maple Street, since the previous homeowner has sadly failed to maintain the property after the fire." There were whispers, a few uneasy glances. She clicked her PowerPoint remote and displayed a digital rendering of a bland shopping complex in place of my family's Victorian home. I stood, calm, steady. Every eye turned to me. "I object," I said. Karen rolled her eyes, arms folding in irritation. "You can't object. You're not a board member." "No," I said, setting down my briefcase and pulling out a thick folder, "but I am the legal property owner of 247 Maple Street. And more importantly," I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my badge, "I'm also a federal judge, and I have a few things to share." Gasps erupted across the room. Karen's face went white. "I have here," I said, holding up a series of documents, "security footage showing HOA board members on my property at 3:00 a.m. the morning my house burned down. I also have bank records linking shell companies to property purchases following mysterious fires, and emails, lots of emails, discussing ways to push out homeowners who refuse to join your HOA, including me." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I also have proof that HOA funds were used for personal renovations," I continued, "and that Karen's husband falsified fire reports to expedite insurance payouts. Oh, and one last thing." I pulled out the USB drive handed to me by Maria, the former treasurer. "This contains 5 years of financial records, wire transfers, and a complete log of every violation notice issued disproportionately to non-HOA members." The room was silent, until Mr. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, slowly stood and said, "I move for a vote of no confidence." "All in favor?" I asked. Hands shot up like wildfire. Even Karen's most loyal supporters didn't dare protect her now. Karen lunged for the projector, frantically flipping slides back to her redevelopment plan. "You don't understand. You'll ruin everything. These accusations, they're lies." I raised one brow. "Then you won't mind the FBI agents waiting outside." Right on cue, the double doors burst open. Badges flashed. Karen let out a strangled cry as 2 agents approached. Her coffee mug clattered to the floor, spilling across the tile. "You're making a mistake!" she shrieked as they placed her in handcuffs. "I built this neighborhood!" "No," I said quietly. "You terrorized it." As Karen and the rest of her board were led out of the room, neighbors erupted into applause. Some cried, others hugged. Years of fear and silence had ended in a single night. I looked out at the people around me, not just neighbors, but survivors of her reign. And for the first time in a long time, the community felt like home again. The courtroom was packed, shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, reporters, and victims from all over the county. The air buzzed with something more powerful than tension: solidarity. These weren't just spectators. They were people who had been silenced, harassed, and nearly driven from their homes by Karen's regime. Now, they came not just to witness the trial, but to stand together. Justice wasn't just mine to deliver. It belonged to all of us. Karen entered the courtroom in a tailored gray suit, a far cry from her usual yoga gear, but even her expensive attire couldn't hide the fear on her face. When her eyes met mine on the bench, she froze. For the first time, she truly saw me, not as the neighbor she tried to destroy, but as the federal judge now presiding over the case that would unravel everything she'd built through lies, intimidation, and fire. As the prosecution laid out its case, the evidence was overwhelming. One by one, the pieces of her empire fell into place. Fraudulent HOA fines, embezzled funds, property destruction, insurance scams, bribed officials, and forced sales through threats and arson. But it wasn't just documents and recordings that carried the weight of justice. It was the voices. Mrs. Rodriguez, tears in her eyes, told the court about the night her family's memories went up in flames. Mr. Patel shared how his children's bedrooms were reduced to ash because he wouldn't cave to Karen's bullying. Others stood too. People Karen thought she had scared into silence, each one adding strength to the case, and more importantly, to each other. Even Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant who'd helped cover it all up, took the stand. When he broke down and admitted his role, it was like a dam bursting. He confessed to doctoring fire reports, to threatening inspectors, to watching silently as his wife turned the HOA into a criminal enterprise. His words shattered the last of Karen's defenses. When I read the verdict aloud, 25 years for Karen, 15 years each for her board members, the room didn't erupt into celebration. It filled with something quieter, but deeper. Release, relief, respect, gratitude. A single clap began in the back row, then another, and soon the entire courtroom stood, not for me, but for each other. Outside, reporters swarmed, but no one sought the spotlight. Instead, neighbors hugged, cried, and simply stood together, breathing for the first time in years without fear. The HOA had once been a weapon, but now we were taking back our power, together. Justice had spoken, not with revenge, but with truth, and it echoed far beyond those courtroom walls. It's been 6 months since the courtroom doors closed behind Karen and her accomplices, and though the ashes of my old home have long been cleared away, the legacy of that fire still burns, but now as a light of renewal. The neighborhood, once clouded in fear and silence, has transformed into something I never imagined possible, a true community. Not one built on control and rules, but on connection, kindness, and shared resilience. We rebuilt my Victorian home exactly as it was. Purple trim, antique windows, and Grandma's rose garden, replanted from cuttings, saved by neighbors who refused to let her memory be buried in smoke. It's more than a house now. It's a symbol. And every time someone walks by and smiles, or stops to admire the roses, I'm reminded that even after destruction, beauty can rise again. What we've all learned from this experience runs deeper than property lines and bylaws. We've seen how unchecked power can grow in silence, and how crucial it is to speak up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. For many of us, particularly those of us who've lived long lives, it's tempting to avoid conflict, to say, this too shall pass. But some injustices don't pass, they grow. And if we don't stand against them, they root themselves in our communities. The most powerful lesson? You're never too old, too tired, or too small to make a difference. I was nearly ready to let Karen win, but something in me, the same something my grandmother instilled when she taught me to tend roses with care, refused to let bullies tear down what matters most: dignity, legacy, and home. Today, we've replaced our HOA with a community council. We meet monthly, not to enforce, but to listen, to support, to laugh. Mr. Patel's kids help manage the community garden. Mrs. Rodriguez hosts Sunday potlucks. Sarah, who once feared speaking out, now leads workshops on HOA rights for seniors. And yes, Karen's former home now belongs to a lovely family who waters the lawn instead of weaponizing it. The headlines have faded, but the healing continues. And if there's one message I'd offer to others, especially seniors who might feel powerless in their own neighborhoods, it's this. Don't underestimate your voice. Don't let fear rob you of your peace. And never forget that even in your quietest years, you carry the wisdom, courage, and strength to change the world around you. Because sometimes, the greatest act of justice is simply deciding to rebuild, with love for everyone.